Today, his canvases command hundreds of millions of dollars. His Sunflowers and The Starry Night are the most recognizable images in the history of art. Museums bearing his name welcome millions of visitors every year. Vincent van Gogh. This name has become synonymous with misunderstood genius and creative madness. Yet, in life, this man was a complete outcast. He was a failed art dealer, a rejected preacher, and a painter whose works were mocked by everyone. According to legend, he sold only a single painting in his entire life, surviving solely at the expense of his younger brother. In the collective consciousness, he remains the madman who, in a fit of delirium, sliced off his own ear and shot himself in the middle of a wheat field. But who was he in reality? Was he simply a lunatic? Or was he a man who felt this world with too much intensity, with too much depth, flaying his own soul just to be able to see the true color of things? His letters to his brother Theo do not reveal the chaos of a diseased mind. Instead, they display a profound wisdom, vast erudition, and an infinite love for humanity and nature. This is the story of his path. It tells of how he descended into the black depths of the coal mines to find God, and how he fled beneath the scorching sun of the South to forge a commune of artists, only to find crushing loneliness. And finally, it is an attempt to cast light upon the mystery of his death. Did the man who poured life onto the canvas with such burning passion truly decide to end it? Or was the gunshot that echoed on that sweltering July day in a French village not a suicide at all, but a tragic accident? One the artist chose to conceal at the cost of his own life, committing his final act of self-sacrifice. Vincent Willem van Gogh was not a child prodigy. Unlike Mozart, who wrote symphonies at the age of 5, or Picasso, who painted like a master in his adolescence, Vincent, in his 20s, was a man without direction, without a trade, and seemingly without a future. He was the black sheep of a respectable Dutch family. Before taking up the brush, he had failed at everything he had attempted. He was born in 1853 into the family of the Protestant pastor Theodorus van Gogh. Religion and art were the two pillars of his lineage. His uncles were successful art dealers, and at first it seemed Vincent would follow in their footsteps. At the age of 16, he began working at the prestigious art firm Goupil & Cie. He sold paintings in The Hague, London, and Paris. He had a future. But it was there that his uncompromising and difficult character manifested itself. He began arguing with clients, telling them that the paintings they were buying were trash of bad taste. He could not sell what he did not love. He was dismissed in disgrace. Finding himself thrown to the margins of life, Vincent turned to religion. But his faith was not the quiet faith of an ordinary citizen. It was a devouring, fanatical passion. He decided that if he could not serve art, he would serve God. He wanted to be a pastor, like his father. However, to enter the Faculty of Theology in Amsterdam, one had to pass complex exams in Latin and Greek. Vincent, lacking both systematic education and patience, failed. He considered dead languages unnecessary for someone who wanted to preach the living word of God to the poor. Then, in 1878, at the age of 25, he made the decision to go where the comfortable priests did not want to go. He went to the Borinage, a coal mining region in southern Belgium. It was a terrible place, which they called the Black Egypt. The earth was covered in coal dust, the air was poisoned by smoke, and the people lived in squalor and filth, dying young from silicosis and mine collapses. Vincent obtained the post of lay preacher. His task was to read the Bible to the miners and console the dying. But he took his mission literally, like the early Christians. He decided he had no right to live in comfort while his flock suffered. He rented a nice room in a boarding house paid for by his father, but soon moved out, considering it an unforgivable luxury. He settled in a miserable hut and slept on straw on the dirt floor. He gave away all his possessions, his warm clothes, his underwear, and even his bed to the poor miners. He himself walked in rags, stained with coal dust, rubbing soot on his face to look like those to whom he preached. He descended into the mines to a depth of 700 meters, into the infernal heat and darkness, to share the labor with the workers. When there was an explosion in the mine and many died or suffered terrible burns, Vincent did not sleep for weeks. He tore his last remaining clothes to make bandages, caring for the wounded. The miners, rough, suspicious people, came to love this strange Dutchman. They called him the Christ of the coal mines. But the official church saw it differently. To the synod officials, Van Gogh's behavior was scandalous. A priest was supposed to be a model of dignity, to wear a frock coat and keep his distance. Vincent, in their opinion, degraded the dignity of the office by looking like a vagabond. An inspection arrived from Brussels. Seeing him in rags, living in a stable, they were horrified. Instead of a reward for his self-sacrifice, they dismissed him with the justification of excess of zeal. It was a devastating blow. Vincent was rejected not only by society, but by the very church to which he wanted to give himself completely. His father, upon hearing the news, became furious and even threatened to commit his son to a psychiatric hospital, the first alarming warning. Vincent stopped writing home. He remained in the Borinage alone, without money, without work, and without God. The winter of 1879 to 1880 arrived, the most terrible winter of his life. He lived like a vagabond, starving, wandering through the snowy fields. He fell into a profound depression. He felt like a total nullity, a man who was useless in this world. In letters to his brother Theo, the only one who did not turn his back on him and continued sending him small sums of money, he compared himself to a bird in a cage. The bird feels that it has been born for something else, but it cannot escape, he wrote. And it was precisely at that point of absolute despair, at the bottom of the abyss, that the metamorphosis occurred. Vincent began to draw. He had drawn before, but they were clumsy sketches. Now, drawing became for him the only way not to go mad, the only way to establish a connection with the world. He looked at the hunched backs of the miners, their emaciated faces, the black mounds of slag under the gray sky, and felt the need to capture that severe truth. He decided that if the church had rejected him, he would serve God in another way. He would show the divine not through sermons, but through depicting the truth of life, even if that life was ugly and dirty. I want to make drawings that touch some people, he wrote to Theo, in which they see not just a figure, but a soul. At the age of 27, an age when many artists already have a name, Vincent van Gogh, lacking education, technique, and talent in the classical sense, his early drawings were clumsy and disproportionate, decided to become an artist. He dedicated himself to it with the same fanaticism with which he preached in the mines. He drew 10 to 12 hours a day, copied anatomy books, studied perspective. His search for the soul in religion ended in failure, but from the ruins of that faith, the artist was born. He left the Borinage and walked to Brussels to study. He took from the mines not only illnesses and a damaged psyche, but also the main theme of his early work, a profound compassion for the poor and humiliated. The desire to paint life as it is in its dark and coarse tones. In 1880, broken and destitute, Vincent van Gogh returned to his parents' house in Etten. He was 27 years old. In the eyes of respectable society and his own family, he was a total failure. A man without a profession, without money, living off his father and his younger brother, Theo. But inside him, a new fire was already burning. He had decided to become an artist. However, the path to art did not begin with inspiration, but with humiliation and exhausting labor. Vincent did not know how to draw. His early sketches were coarse, rigid, lacking proportion. But he possessed something that many talented academy students did not have: a fanatical, almost terrifying tenacity. He copied drawing manuals, sketched peasants in the fields, and worked to the point of exhaustion, trying to force his hand to obey his eye. His life during this period was a succession of catastrophes in his personal relationships. First, he fell in love with his cousin, the young widow Key Voss. His love was like everything in his life: frantic, obsessive, and frightening. She rejected him with a resounding no, nay, never. But Vincent did not back down. He pursued her, wrote her letters, and went to her parents' house in Amsterdam. When they refused to let him see her, legend says he held his hand over the flame of an oil lamp and said, "Let me see her for as long as I can keep my hand in the flame." They blew out the lamp and threw Vincent out of the house. It was another lesson in pain. His passion only drove people away. After the scandal with his cousin, he went to The Hague, where he began to study painting with a relative, the famous artist Anton Mauve. But conflict awaited him there, too. Mauve taught him to draw plaster casts of ancient gods. Vincent, furious, smashed the plaster casts, declaring that he wanted to draw living people, not dead copies. In The Hague, he committed an act that definitively turned him into a pariah in the eyes of his family. He took in a pregnant, syphilis-stricken prostitute from the streets named Sienne Hornick. She already had one child and was expecting a second. Vincent, driven by the same thirst for salvation as in the mines, brought her to live with him in his tiny studio. He wanted to save her, to give her a home. She became his model, his housekeeper, and possibly the only woman with whom he ever tried to form a family. It was based on her that he drew one of his most moving early works, the graphic drawing Sorrow. It depicts a naked, withered woman sitting, hugging her knees and hiding her face. In this drawing, there is no eroticism, only an infinite compassion for human pain. But to his family, this was hitting rock bottom. Living with a prostitute was unthinkable. Under pressure from his father and his brother Theo, who threatened to cut off financial support, which meant starvation for all of them, Vincent was forced to leave Sienne. This separation broke his heart. Once again, he felt he had betrayed a human being just to survive. In late 1883, lonely and battered by life, he returned again to his parents, who now lived in the village of Nieuwenin. His father, the pastor, was ashamed of his son, but he assigned him a space for a studio in an old laundry room in the backyard. Here in Nieuwenin, Vincent spent 2 years that art historians call his dark period. While in Paris, the Impressionists had already discovered light and brilliant colors, Vincent painted the earth. His palette consisted of the colors he saw around him: the color of dirty potatoes, the color of plowed earth, the color of old wood, the color of soot. He used bitumen, ochre, dark green. He painted weavers at their looms, old church towers, peasant faces furrowed with wrinkles. He wanted to paint peasant life as it is, coarse, hard, but honest. He said, "A painting of peasants should not smell of perfume. It should smell of bacon, of smoke, of potato steam, of manure. That is healthy." That is not unhealthy. The pinnacle of this period was his first monumental painting, The Potato Eaters, 1885. Vincent worked on it all winter, making dozens of sketches, studying the faces, the hands, the interior of the poor hut. The painting shows the de Groot peasant family sitting around a rough table by the light of a dim oil lamp. They are eating roasted potatoes and drinking cheap coffee, a chicory substitute. Their faces are coarse, almost caricatured, resembling the potatoes themselves. Their hands are knotty, bony, dirty. Vincent wrote to his brother Theo, "I have tried to emphasize that those people, eating their potatoes in the lamplight, have dug the earth with those very hands they put in the dish, that they have thus honestly earned their food." For him, it was a religious painting. It was the communion of the poor. The lamplight over the table was for him a symbol of the divine presence in their miserable lives. He considered this painting his masterpiece, the proof that he had become a true artist. He sent the painting to Theo in Paris, expecting a triumph. But the reaction was a failure. Theo, who'd already seen the works of Monet, Renoir, and Degas, was horrified by this somber, dirty, and ugly painting. He wrote to his brother, "Everyone here loves light. Your painting is too dark. The figures are too coarse. No one will buy this." A friend of Vincent's, the artist Anton van Rappard, criticized the anatomy of the figures, calling the work clumsy. Vincent felt wounded. He did not understand why they couldn't see the truth and the soul in that darkness. He defended his work furiously, accusing the critics of superficiality. But deep in his soul, he began to doubt. In March 1885, his father, Pastor Theodorus, died suddenly of a stroke on the threshold of their house. Vincent's relations with his family, already tense, collapsed definitively. His mother and sisters blamed his strange lifestyle and constant scandals for their father's premature death. They made it clear he was no longer welcome in that house. The Noonan period ended. Vincent understood he was at a dead end. His dark painting found no response. His attempts to form a family had failed. His religious quests had led to conflict with his father. He was 32 years old. He had no home, no money, no recognition. He had only his brother Theo, who continued to believe in him despite everything and kept sending him 50 francs a month. Vincent realized he needed to flee. He needed to see that light Theo wrote about. He needed to learn. First, he went to Antwerp, where he discovered Japanese woodblock prints and the brilliant colors of Rubens for the first time. He began to starve, spending all his brother's money not on food, but on models and paints. His teeth began to fall out. His stomach was ruined. But Antwerp was only a stopover. The main goal lay beyond. In February 1886, Theo, who lived in Paris, received a brief note. "I shall be at the Louvre from midday, or sooner if you like." Vincent had arrived in Paris. He went there in search of light. But he did not know that this light would be so bright that, in the end, it would consume his mind. From the darkness of the coal mines and peasant huts, he took a step into the radiant world of Impressionism. In February 1886, Vincent van Gogh arrived in Paris. For him, this event was not a simple move, but a culture shock comparable to landing on another planet. He came from a gray, conservative Holland, where art had frozen in the dark tones of the old masters, to a city that was living through the most radical artistic revolution since the Renaissance. Paris was boiling. It was the era of the Third Republic, the time of the Eiffel Tower, which was just beginning to be built, of electric lighting, and above all, of Impressionism. Vincent moved in with his brother Theo on the Rue Lepic in Montmartre. Theo was not just a loving brother. He was a successful art dealer, managing a branch of the famous gallery Goupil and Siey. Through Theo, Vincent gained direct access to the avant-garde of the time, and what he saw plunged him into despair. Vincent had brought with him his somber paintings, peasants, weavers, potato eaters, painted in earth tones. He was proud of them. But when Theo showed him the canvases of Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, and Camille Pissarro, Vincent understood something terrible. His painting was hopelessly obsolete. While in Holland he was trying to transmit the soul through darkness, in Paris, artists had already broken light down into the spectrum. Their paintings shone with pure, unmixed colors, blue, red, yellow, green. They did not paint in suffocating studios, but outdoors, en plein air, capturing momentary impressions. For the stubborn and proud Vincent, acknowledging his backwardness was torture. But he possessed an incredible capacity to learn. He decided to re-educate himself from scratch. He shed his old skin and began to avidly absorb the new techniques. He entered the studio of the famous teacher Fernand Colmont. There he met young artists who would become legends. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, a short aristocrat who painted the life of cabarets and brothels, and Émile Bernard. They accepted into their circle this strange, red-haired, poorly dressed Dutchman who looked older than he was, and argued until he was hoarse. Under their influence, Van Gogh's palette began to lighten rapidly. Bitumen and soot disappeared. In their place came cobalt, ultramarine, emerald green, chrome, vermilion. He experimented with pointillism, the technique of Georges Seurat and Paul Signac, where the image is created from thousands of tiny dots of pure color. Vincent, however, transformed this technique in his own way. Instead of neat, scientific dots, he began to use short, energetic strokes, dashes, which would become his signature style. His brush began not just to apply paint, but to sculpt form, creating a vibrant, living surface. But perhaps the strongest influence came not from the French, but from the Japanese. At that time, the fashion of Japanisme reigned in Paris. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints, which in Japan were often used as wrapping paper, were a revelation in Europe. Vincent was fascinated by them. He spent his last money on cheap prints by Hokusai and Hiroshige, decorating the walls of his room with them. Japanese art taught him a completely new way to see composition. The Japanese did not use traditional European perspective that fades into the distance. They used flat patches of color, strong outlines, diagonal constructions, and framing that cut objects off at the edge of the sheet. Vincent began copying these prints in oil and then applying these principles to his landscapes and portraits. He dreamed of Japan as a country of light, harmony, and pure color, where artists lived like brothers. This idealized dream of a Japanese paradise would later push him toward the south of France. The Parisian period was a time of incredible productivity. In 2 years, Vincent painted more than 200 canvases. He painted everything: views of Montmartre, which was then a semi-rural suburb with windmills, still lifes with flowers, experimenting with contrasts, portraits of friends. He painted the famous series of sunflowers, the first Parisian series, where the wilted flowers lie on a table, which impressed even the sophisticated Gauguin. It was precisely his meeting with Paul Gauguin that proved fatal. Gauguin, a former stockbroker who abandoned his family and career for art, was a charismatic, self-assured, and cynical adventurer. He had recently returned from Martinique and dreamed of a primitive, savage life. For Vincent, who was always looking for a mentor and a kindred spirit, Gauguin became an idol. He saw in him the leader of the future art of the tropics. But Parisian life had its dark side. Vincent was a man of extremes. He did not know how to live in moderation. Life in the big city, constant arguments about art in smoke-filled cafes, cheap wine, and, of course, absinthe, the green fairy of the Parisian bohemia, began to destroy his health. Absinthe at that time was not just alcohol. It was a cheap, toxic hallucinogen that caused addiction and bouts of aggression. Vincent's character, already complex, became unbearable. He argued constantly with Theo. Living with him in the same apartment was torment. Vincent was messy. He filled the room with canvases and paints. He talked non-stop, swinging from euphoria to depression in a matter of minutes. Theo, a man of fragile health, wrote home to Holland, "Life with Vincent is unendurable. It is as if there are two different people in him, one marvelously gifted, fine, and tender, the other egoistic and hard." They loved each other, but Paris was suffocating them both. By the winter of 1887, Vincent was nearing a breakdown. His hands began to shake. He had stomach pains and attacks of baseless anxiety. He understood that Paris had given him everything it could: technique, color, an understanding of modern art. But now that city was taking his life. "I am leaving for the south," he told Toulouse-Lautrec, "to find Japan there." In his imagination, the south of France, Provence, with its brilliant sun and vivid colors, was the European equivalent of his beloved Japan. He did not dream of simply leaving. He was gestating a grandiose plan. He wanted to create the Studio of the South in Provence, a commune of artists, a brotherhood where painters would live together, work outdoors, share expenses and income, and support each other, free from the dictates of Parisian dealers and critics. And as the head, as the abbot of this monastery of art, he saw Paul Gauguin. In February 1888, tired, sick, but full of new hopes, Vincent took a train to Arles. He was leaving behind the gray north, the Parisian fog, and the arguments. He was going to meet the sun, which was supposed to burn away the last shadows from his paintings and the last fears from his soul. He did not know he was going to meet his own madness. When the train arrived in Arles, Vincent did not see Japan, but snow. Provence welcomed him with an anomalous snowfall. But when the snow melted, a world of light and color more frantic than he had ever seen opened before him. Blossoming orchards, azure skies, golden fields. Here, in Arles, the most prolific, most brilliant, and most tragic year in the history of art would begin. In Arles, under the scorching sun of Provence, Van Gogh's art reached its zenith. He worked at superhuman speed, as if he felt he had little time left. In 15 months, he created nearly 200 paintings. He painted blossoming orchards, the Langlois Bridge, the night cafe, the starry sky over the Rhone. His brushwork became even more energetic. The paint was laid onto the canvas in thick, dense strokes, the impasto technique, often straight from the tube. Yellow, the color of the sun, of light, and, as he hoped, of happiness, became the dominant color of his palette. In May 1888, he rented a small wing in a building at number 2 Place Lamartine. It was the famous Yellow House. In Vincent's imagination, it was not a simple dwelling. It was the monastery of the new art, the studio of the South. He dreamed that like-minded artists would settle there, work together, share their bread and paints, support each other, and create the art of the future. And the first monk, the abbot of this brotherhood, was to be Paul Gauguin. Vincent bombarded Gauguin with letters begging him to come, but Gauguin, cynical and calculating, was in no hurry. He was sick, penniless, trapped in Brittany, but the prospect of living in a provincial town with an unbalanced Dutchman did not appeal to him. Everything was decided by Theo van Gogh. In fact, he bribed Gauguin. Theo, as an art dealer, promised Gauguin a monthly allowance and the purchase of his paintings in exchange for going to Arles and looking after Vincent. For Gauguin, it was a business deal. For Vincent, it was the fulfillment of a dream. Preparing for his friend's arrival, Vincent entered a feverish state. He wanted to decorate the house to make it worthy of the master. It was during these days, waiting for Gauguin, that he created his most famous series, the sunflowers. He painted them compulsively before the flowers withered. He wanted the walls of Gauguin's room to shine with gold. For him, the sunflower was a symbol of gratitude and friendship. On October 23, 1888, Paul Gauguin arrived in Arles. The first few weeks seemed like an idyll. They worked together, walked, cooked, visited brothels, and argued endlessly about art. But very soon, it became clear that it was a union of ice and fire. They were incompatible. Vincent was emotional, chaotic, romantic. He worked fast, obeying instinct, and painted only from life. For him, nature was sacred. Gauguin was arrogant, cold, methodical. He despised working from life, believing the artist should paint from the head, from memory, stylizing and simplifying forms. The arguments grew increasingly heated. "Our discussions are highly charged with electricity," Vincent wrote to his brother. "We emerge from them with our heads as exhausted as a discharged electric battery." Gauguin began to pressure Vincent, criticizing his style, imposing his method. He forced Vincent to paint from memory. Van Gogh tried, but it came out wrong. He was losing the ground beneath his feet. The atmosphere in the yellow house boiled over. Vincent, whose psyche was already weakened by alcohol, they drank a lot of absinthe and wine, poor diet and exhaustion, began to fear that Gauguin would leave. The fear of loneliness, the fear that his dream of brotherhood would collapse, turned into paranoia. Gauguin, for his part, felt trapped. He was irritated by Vincent's messiness, his obsession, his strange mood swings. He began to paint a portrait of Van Gogh working, the painter of sunflowers, in which he depicted Vincent with a half-demented look. Upon seeing the painting, Van Gogh said sadly, "Yes, it's me. But it's me gone mad." In mid-December, Gauguin announced he was leaving. For Vincent, that was the end of the world. The climax arrived on December 23, 1888. All day the Mistral blew, a freezing, penetrating wind that in Provence they call the wind of madness. The tension in the house reached its breaking point. At night, according to Gauguin's memoirs, which are the only source and must be taken with caution, there was a fight. Gauguin left the house for a walk. He heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw Vincent coming toward him with an open razor in his hand. Gauguin's stare stopped him. Vincent lowered his head and ran back to the yellow house. Gauguin, frightened, decided to spend the night in a hotel. Vincent remained alone. In a fit of acute psychosis, hearing voices or trying to silence the unbearable pain of the soul with physical pain, he took the razor to his left ear and sliced it off. For a long time it was believed he only cut off the lobe, but a recently discovered drawing by Dr. Ray, who treated him, confirms that the ear was severed almost completely. The blood spurted, as ears are full of arteries. Vincent stopped the bleeding as best he could, wrapping his head in towels. Then, he did something even stranger. He wrapped the severed ear in a newspaper, put on a beret to hide the bandage, and went to his favorite brothel. There, he asked to see a girl named Rachel, or Gabby, to whom he had perhaps promised a gift earlier, and handed her the package with the words, "Keep this object carefully." The girl, upon opening the package and seeing the bloody flesh, fainted. Panic ensued in the brothel, and the police were called. Meanwhile, Vincent returned home, lay down on his bed, and lost consciousness from blood loss. In the morning, the police found him. The house was flooded with blood. It was on the floor, on the walls, on the mirror. There were bloody handprints on the doors. Vincent was alive, but weak. He was urgently sent to the Hôtel Dieu hospital. Gauguin, upon hearing what happened, did not even visit his friend. He sent a telegram to Theo and left Arles immediately, disappearing from Vincent's life forever. The dream of the Studio of the South died in a pool of blood. In the hospital, Vincent regained his reason, but his life in Arles was over. The citizens, who already looked askance at the strange, red-haired painter, now feared him. 80 residents of the town signed a petition to the mayor demanding the isolation of the red-headed madman, as he was a danger to society. It was a betrayal by the very people he had painted, the people he had loved. The police sealed the yellow house. Vincent ended up in the isolation cell of the hospital, locked up, rejected, and branded a madman. Theo rushed from Paris to comfort his brother. Vincent was dejected, but surprisingly calm. He understood that his mind was sick. The attacks could repeat at any moment. He could no longer live alone. He needed protection from himself. In May 1889, Vincent van Gogh voluntarily boarded a train and headed to the neighboring town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. There, in an old monastery, was the asylum for the mentally ill, Saint-Paul de Moselle. He went there not as a visitor, but as a patient. He surrendered. He acknowledged his defeat to the illness. But he did not know that precisely there, behind the bars of the asylum, looking at the night sky through the iron grates, he would paint the picture that would become an icon of world art. The ear incident was the point of no return. The man, Vincent, was broken. But the artist, Vincent, was preparing for his final and most powerful ascent. Ahead of him lay a year in the madhouse. On May 8, 1889, Vincent van Gogh arrived at the Saint Paul de Moselle Asylum, housed in an old 12th century monastery near the town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. It was a quiet, secluded place, surrounded by wheat fields, vineyards, and olive groves. Vincent had voluntarily deprived himself of his freedom. He feared himself. He feared the new attacks that assaulted him suddenly, plunging him into an abyss of hallucinations and terror. He hoped that the regimen, the calm, and the medical observation would help him heal. They assigned him 2 small rooms with east-facing windows. He used one as a bedroom, the other as a studio. The windows had iron bars. Through those bars, Vincent looked at the world. His universe contracted to the size of the hospital garden, enclosed by a wall with a view of a wheat field and the foothills of the Alps on the horizon. Life in the asylum was monotonous. The screams of other patients at night, the smell of medicines and boiled food, the long corridors where shadows of people who had lost their reason wandered. But the doctors, seeing that drawing was the only thing keeping Vincent afloat, allowed him to work. And he worked with a frantic obsession. Painting became a lightning rod for his illness. "I am working like one possessed," he wrote to Theo, "in a dumb fury of work, more than ever." It was here, within the walls of Saint-Rémy, that Van Gogh's style underwent its final and dramatic transformation. If in Arles his paintings were full of sun and joy, now anxiety, vibration, and a mystical force appeared in them. His brushstroke changed. The lines became sinuous, coiling into spirals and whirlpools. The paint was applied so thickly that the pictures looked like bas-reliefs. It seemed that the very matter on his canvases was in constant, tortuous motion. cypresses twisted like tongues of black fire, olive trees contorted as if in agony. Mountains swelled like ocean waves. It was a direct reflection of what was happening in his head. The electrical discharges of his brain spilled onto the canvas. He stopped simply copying reality. He began to represent the energy hidden inside things. The culmination of this period was a night in mid-June 1889. Vincent could not sleep. He looked out the window of his cell into the night sky. 3 days earlier, he had written to Theo, "This morning I saw the country from my window a long time before sunrise, with nothing but the morning star, which looked very big." That star was Venus. That night, or perhaps over several days, working from memory and imagination, which was rare for him, and a deviation from his principles, he created the Starry Night. This painting is not a photograph of the night sky. It is a visionary prophecy. On the canvas, we see a sleeping village with a pointed church spire that recalls the Dutch churches of his homeland, not the Provençal ones, a sign of his nostalgia. The village is quiet and still, but above it, in the sky, a cosmic drama unfolds. The sky boils. Enormous swirling whirlpools of energy spin in the center, resembling galaxies or water currents. The stars are not simple points of light. They are giant, pulsating orbs surrounded by radiant halos. The moon shines so brightly it looks like a sun, and in the foreground, uniting earth and sky, stands an enormous black cypress. For Van Gogh, as for all European culture, the cypress was the tree of death, the tree planted in cemeteries. That black silhouette resembling a flame is the artist himself, standing between the sleeping world of humans and the eternal, raging cosmos. The Starry Night is a painting about death and immortality. Vincent wrote, "Looking at the stars always makes me dream. Why, I ask myself, shouldn't the shining dots of the sky be as accessible as the black dots on the map of France? Just as we take a train to get to Tarascon or Rouen, we take death to reach a star." For him, the stars were the place where souls go. In his madness and loneliness, he looked to the sky not with scientific interest, but with the hope of liberation. It is interesting to note that modern astrophysicists, analyzing the Starry Night, discovered that the turbulent whirlpools in the painting correspond with mathematical precision to the laws of fluid dynamics, described by the physicist Kolmogorov many years later. The intuition of the mad genius penetrated the essence of physical phenomena more deeply than the reason of scientists. But creating masterpieces did not save him from the illness. The attacks returned, becoming increasingly severe and prolonged. During one of them, in the summer of 1889, when he was forbidden to go out and paint en plein air, Vincent suffered a crisis right while working. He tried to swallow his paints. The doctors considered it an attempt at poisoning and suicide. They forbade him from painting for several weeks. That was the worst punishment for him. Deprived of his brush, he spent hours sitting in his room staring at the wall. He heard voices accusing him of sins. He saw waking nightmares. The religious images he had renounced 10 years ago returned to him in a distorted and terrifying form. In autumn and winter, his condition stabilized somewhat. He began to copy works by his favorite masters, Millet, Delacroix, Rembrandt, but in his own style, translating their black and white engravings into the language of color. He painted the moving Prisoners Exercising, a copy of a Doré engraving where inmates walk in an endless circle in the deep well of a prison yard. One of them, in the center, hatless and red-haired, looks at the viewer. It was a self-portrait. Vincent felt like a prisoner. In early 1890, news arrived that both gladdened and alarmed him. Theo and his wife Jo had a son. They named the boy Vincent Willem. in honor of his uncle. The artist was moved to tears. He painted for his nephew the tender picture Almond Blossom, azure blue, full of hope and new life. But the birth of his nephew also meant something else. Theo now had a family to support. Expenses were growing, and Vincent continued to live completely at his expense, contributing not a penny. The feeling of guilt, the sensation of being a burden, a parasite eating the food of his brother's child, began to gnaw at him from the inside. By the spring of 1890, Vincent realized that Saint-Remy was not helping him. The atmosphere of the madhouse, the screams of the sick, the isolation, all of this only worsened his condition. He feared that if he stayed there, he would definitely become a chronic lunatic. He needed to escape. He needed to go north. He wrote to Theo, asking permission to move closer to Paris. Theo found the ideal place, the small village of Auvers, just an hour from the capital. There lived Dr. Paul Gauguin, a physician specializing in the treatment of melancholia and nervous diseases, a friend of the Impressionists, and an amateur painter himself. Gauguin agreed to care for Vincent. In May 1890, Van Gogh left the asylum. He took with him 150 paintings created during his year of confinement. Among them were the Starry Night, the irises, the cypresses. It was the luggage of a genius. He went north with the hope of healing and a new life, but he did not know that he had only 70 days left to live. And those days would become a final, frantic sprint toward eternity. On May 20th, 1890, Vincent van Gogh stepped off the train in the small village of Auvers, located 30 kilometers north of Paris. It was a picturesque and quiet place, with thatched roofs and infinite fields, which had long been a favorite of landscape painters like Daubigny and Corot. Vincent arrived there seeking salvation. He hoped that rural life, proximity to his beloved brother Theo, who lived in Paris, and the observation of a doctor would help him definitively defeat the illness. His doctor was Paul Gauguin. He was a colorful figure. Gauguin was a specialist in nervous diseases and melancholia, a supporter of homeopathy, a socialist, and a passionate lover of art. He was friends with Renoir, Manet, and Cézanne, and his house was overflowing with paintings he often accepted as payment for his treatments. He had been recommended to Theo as someone who could understand the complex soul of an artist. However, Vincent's first encounter with the doctor left him with mixed feelings. Van Gogh, who possessed a terrifying perceptiveness, saw in Gauguin not a savior, but a reflection of himself. "I think we must not count on Dr. Gauguin at all," he wrote to Theo. "First of all, he is sicker than I am, I think, or, shall we say, just as much." Gauguin was an eccentric widower, prone to depression, but he sincerely admired Vincent's work and encouraged him to paint. A strange and intense friendship developed between doctor and patient. Vincent often dined at Gauguin's house, and it was there that he painted the famous Portrait of Dr. Gauguin, the image of a man with incredibly sad and melancholic eyes, in which, according to Vincent, the heartbroken expression of our time was reflected. The Auvers period became the final sprint of Van Gogh's life. Never before had he worked with such superhuman intensity. In his 70 days in Auvers, he created nearly 80 paintings and 64 drawings. That is more than one finished work per day. It was not simple productivity, it was obsession. He seemed to feel that time was running out, and he rushed to pour onto the canvas everything he had accumulated inside him. His style changed again. The brushstroke became even more nervous, broken, baroque, forms distorted, submitting to internal emotion. He painted the famous church at Auvers. On the canvas, the old Gothic building does not sit firmly on the ground but seems to melt, to flow, ready to dissolve into the air. The sky above the church is not blue, but a heavy, oppressive, purplish black. In this painting, there are no doors or entrance, a symbol that Vincent, the former preacher, had definitively lost access to God and the comfort of religion. At first, it seemed Auvers was doing him good. He wrote to Theo that he felt calmer, that the nightmare of Saint-Remy had receded. But that calm was deceptive. Beneath the surface of feverish activity, a dark anxiety was growing. The main source of that anxiety was, curiously, his beloved brother. Theo Van Gogh's life in Paris at that moment was full of problems. He had a new son, little Vincent, who was often ill. Theo began having serious conflicts with the owners of the gallery where he worked. He was thinking of quitting and opening his own business, but that required capital and was a huge risk. Furthermore, Theo's own health, suffering from syphilis, was beginning to deteriorate rapidly. Vincent perceived all this through their letters. He, who had always lived at his brother's expense, suddenly felt like an unbearable burden. He, a 37-year-old man who could not feed himself, was taking bread from his little nephew and his sick brother. The feeling of guilt that had always lived within him became unendurable. He began to see himself as a parasite, destroying the life of the only person who loved him. On July 6th, Vincent went to Paris to visit Theo. That visit was a catastrophe. A tense atmosphere reigned in his brother's apartment.
Theo was exhausted. His wife Jo was on the verge of a breakdown due to the child's illness and financial fears. There was a difficult conversation about money and the future. Vincent felt he was in the way, that he was a hindrance. He returned hastily, almost in panic, to Auvers, feeling rejected and frightened. "I feel that I am a failure. That is my destiny. I accept it, and it will not change," he wrote shortly after returning. From that moment on, his painting changed. He became obsessed with the fields. Around Auvers stretched infinite wheat fields. Vincent spent entire days there under the scorching July sun. He painted plains that lose themselves in infinity under a restless sky. In these landscapes, there were no longer human figures, only earth and sky. He wrote to Theo, "I have tried to express in them sadness, extreme loneliness." Those fields became for him the image of his own life, empty, infinite, and exposed to all winds. The culmination of this state, the visual testament of the artist, was the painting Wheatfield with Crows. Many consider it the master's final work, though it is not exactly proven, but by its mood, it is undoubtedly the final period. In this canvas, we see a rough, almost furious painting. The golden wheat is painted with abrupt, chaotic strokes, as if under the blows of the wind. The sky is dark blue, stormy, heavy, ready to crash down upon the earth. Across the field run 3 paths, but none leads to the horizon. None leads to a house or a goal. The paths disperse into nothingness. They cut off in the field. They are dead ends. And over all this, like dark and sinister marks, rises a flock of crows. They fly straight toward the viewer. Birds of death, messengers of misfortune. In this painting, there is no hope. There is no light from the sunflowers. There is only a cry of despair and the sensation of an imminent catastrophe. Vincent did not just paint a landscape. He painted his mental state, the state of a cornered man surrounded by the storm who has nowhere to go. The last days of July were unbearably hot. Vincent kept working, but his behavior became increasingly strange. He argued with Dr. Gauguin, accusing him of indifference toward his art. There is a legend that he even threatened the doctor with a pistol, but it is unconfirmed. He wrote letters he never sent.
One of those letters, found in his pocket after his death, was addressed to Theo. In it were lines that sounded like a farewell and a sentence upon himself. "Well, my own work. I am risking my life for it, and my reason has half foundered because of it." He understood the madness was returning. He feared becoming violent again, being locked up again, but he feared even more becoming an eternal burden to his brother. He decided that his death would solve all problems. It would free Theo from the financial burden and possibly raise the prices of his paintings. He knew that dead artists were valued more. On July 27, 1890, a Sunday after lunch, Vincent van Gogh left the Revue Inn, where he rented a room. He carried his easel and paints as usual. But according to the version of many biographers, in his pocket he carried another object, possibly stolen from the innkeeper or traded with a local. An old, rusty 7mm Le Faucheux revolver, a weapon meant to scare birds, not to kill. He walked toward the fields, toward that very place he had painted in his last picture. The sun beat down mercilessly. The golden wheat rose like a wall. Crows circled in the sky. The artist was left alone with his destiny. At this moment, history pauses, leaving us before one of the most tragic and mysterious scenes in the history of art. At dusk on July 27, 1890, as the sun began to set, the inhabitants of Auvers-sur-Oise witnessed a strange scene. Vincent van Gogh, who had gone out into the fields after lunch with an energetic step and his easel on his back, was returning to the Revue Inn. But he was walking strangely. He clutched his stomach, staggered, and limped. He carried neither his easel nor his paints. When he entered the inn's cafe, breathing heavily, the owners, Gustave and Arthur Revue, asked him what had happened. Vincent only murmured, "I am wounded." With great difficulty, he climbed the narrow staircase to his tiny attic room, number 5. The alarmed owner followed him up and found the artist lying on the bed, curled into a ball, facing the wall. When Mr. Revue asked him what was wrong, Vincent unbuttoned his shirt and revealed a small, dark, bleeding wound in his abdomen, just below the ribs. "I wanted to kill myself," he said quietly, "but I failed." They urgently called the local doctor, Dr. Misery, and then Dr. Gauguin. After examining the wound, the doctors reached a grim conclusion. The bullet had entered the body, but had not exited. It had lodged somewhere near the spine, miraculously, without immediately damaging vital organs, but causing internal bleeding. With the rural medicine of 1890, extracting the bullet was impossible. The operation would have killed him faster than the wound. Gauguin bandaged Vincent, left him to rest, and sent an urgent letter to Theo in Paris. Vincent spent the night in his room, smoking his pipe. He did not moan, he did not complain. He was completely lucid and seemed surprisingly calm, like a man who had finally finished a hard day's work. When the gendarmes arrived to interrogate him about the suicide attempt, which was considered both a crime and a sin, he replied briefly and firmly, "My body is my own, and I am free to do what I want with it. Do not accuse anyone. It is I that wanted to kill myself." The next day, Monday, Theo arrived in haste. He found his brother conscious. Vincent even tried to joke, saying, "This time I missed the shot too," referring to his failure to die instantly. Theo, weeping, begged him to fight. He promised him they would cure him, that better times would come. Vincent looked at him and uttered words that became some of the most famous in history. "La tristesse durera toujours." The sadness will last forever. On the night of July 29, 1890, at 1:30 in the morning,
Vincent van Gogh's heart stopped. He was 37 years old. In the pocket of his jacket, they found a final, unsent letter to Theo, containing the phrase that became his epitaph. "Well, my own work, I am risking my life for it, and my reason has half foundered because of it." The official version of his death, suicide resulting from depression and madness, was universally accepted and went unquestioned for over 100 years. The lonely, sick genius could take no more and pulled the trigger. This story fit perfectly into the romantic myth of the cursed artist. However, in 2011, biographers Stephen Naifeh and Gregory White-Smith, after 10 years of research, presented a sensational alternative theory that overturns our understanding of Van Gogh's death. They claim that Vincent did not shoot himself. He was shot. And it was not premeditated murder, but a tragic accident, a recklessness that turned into drama. What is this theory based on? First, the nature of the wound. The bullet entered the abdomen at a strange, oblique angle, something extremely difficult to do when shooting oneself. Furthermore, the shot was not at point-blank range. There were no powder burns on the shirt or skin, which are characteristic of a close-range shot. Second, the weapon. The revolver was never found. The one exhibited in museums was found in the field 60 years later, and its ownership is unproven.
If Vincent wanted to kill himself, why did he choose a rusty, low-power 7mm Lefaucheux revolver used to scare crows, and not a reliable weapon? And where did his easel, canvas, and paints go? They also disappeared without a trace. A person going out to shoot himself rarely takes his entire painting kit just to hide it later. Third, and most importantly, the figure of René Secretan. He was a 16-year-old Parisian teenager from a wealthy family spending the summer in Auvers. René was the local bully, the leader of a gang of boys who mocked the strange painter. They put salt in his coffee, put snakes in his paint box. They provoked him. René liked to play cowboy. He wore a Buffalo Bill costume and, as is known for a fact, possessed that very defective 7mm revolver, which he often twirled in his hands, scaring people. According to this theory, that day, René and his friends encountered Vincent in the fields. Perhaps they started harassing him again, or perhaps René was simply playing with the gun and it accidentally went off. The bullet struck the artist in the stomach. Terrified by the consequences, an accusation of murder, the teenagers fled, taking the weapon and possibly the painting materials to hide the evidence. Why, then, did Vincent say he had done it himself? The biographers believe it was his final act of love and self-sacrifice. He knew he was dying. He knew they would throw René in prison, and he did not want to ruin the life of a stupid boy. But mainly, he knew that his death would solve Theo's problems. He felt like a burden. That accidental gunshot became a way out for him, a gift of fate that he accepted. By taking the blame, he left this life as a martyr, protecting his killers and freeing his brother. If this theory is correct, Van Gogh's death was not an act of despair, but an act of supreme mercy. Vincent's funeral took place in Auvers. The coffin was literally covered in sunflowers and yellow dahlias, his favorite flowers, the flowers of the sun he lacked so much. Theo was so crushed by grief that he could barely stand. For Theo, his brother's death was a mortal blow. His entire life, all his efforts had been dedicated to supporting Vincent. He believed in his genius when no one else did. Upon losing that purpose, he broke. His health, undermined by syphilis, collapsed. A few months after the funeral, Theo lost his mind. He died in a clinic in Utrecht in January 1891, just 6 months after Vincent. He could not live without his other half. In 1914, his remains were transferred to Auvers and buried next to Vincent. Now, the two brothers, whom in life were united by such a painful and indissoluble bond, rest under identical gravestones, entwined by the same ivy. In death, they are finally inseparable. But the story does not end there. There remains a third hero, without whom we would never have known of Van Gogh. It is Johanna. Jo Van Gogh Bonger, Theo's widow, left alone with a small child and an apartment crammed with hundreds of paintings no one wanted to buy, she could have thrown them away or sold them for pennies as old junk. She was advised to do just that. But Johanna was an intelligent and loyal woman. She believed her husband's words about Vincent's genius. She dedicated her entire life to ensuring the world knew of him. She organized exhibitions. She published the brothers' correspondence, those very letters that allowed us to see the artist's soul. Methodically, step by step, she built his fame. It was thanks to this fragile woman that the world discovered Van Gogh. 10 years after his death, the prices of his paintings began to rise. 20 years later, he was a recognized genius. 100 years later, his portrait of Dr. Gauguin sold for $82.5 million, a record at the time.
The man who in life begged his brother for money for paints and bread became the most expensive artist in history. Vincent van Gogh lived a life full of pain, failure, and loneliness. But he left behind a world seen through his eyes, a world vibrating with color, energy, and love. He showed that even in the simplest object, an old boot, a chair, a sunflower, hides a divine beauty. His tragedy became his triumph. As he predicted in one of his letters, the painter dies, but his painting remains. And his painting, born from the darkness of madness, continues to shine brighter than the stars he loved so much to paint through the bars of his cell.